Well, hello again, family and friends. Today I want to tell you a story about a country as well as an individual missionary who impacted that country significantly. The country is Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been called one of the greatest human disasters of the 20th century. And why? Well, here are some statistics about this country. When I wrote a book in 2002, a booklet called Hope for Afghanistan, after Dana Curry and Heather Mercer were released from prison there and after 9/11. And on the back of this booklet, I listed the situation in Afghanistan at that time. This was 20 years ago. Afghanistan has 48,000 mosques, but not one church building. Every family has lost a member or is separated from a member due to war. 25% of the young women are war widows. 50% of the children die from disease or malnutrition before age 5. 40% of men are literate, but only 10% of the women. 40% of children have lost at least one parent in the last 4 years. 80% of the people drink contaminated water. No wonder Afghanistan has been called one of the greatest human disasters of the 20th century, a land where people today have little hope. Well, there still are 48,000 mosques or probably more now in Afghanistan, and no church buildings officially. Now, there is a chapel today in the embassy compound in Kabul of Italy. Italy's embassy houses a room that is set aside as a chapel for Christian services. However, it is restricted to only expatriates from other countries out of the country. There is no church building in Afghanistan for the people. And that is one of the stories I want to tell you about, because at one time there was a church building. It's an amazing story. The Apostle Thomas is reported to have visited Afghanistan in 50 AD, which was the first arrival of the Christian message to the people of that country. In the 5th and 6th century, the Nestorian Christians were quite significant in the area at that time, sharing the gospel. But by the 900s, Islam had become dominant in the region, and especially dominant in Afghanistan. The missionary I want to tell you about was a man named J. Christy Wilson Jr. We'll call him Christy Wilson. He was born in Iran in 1921, the same year as Prince Philip, who just recently passed away, of missionary parents. So Christy Wilson grew up in Iran in a family of missionaries to the country of Iran. And their neighboring country was Afghanistan. And when Christy Wilson was a young man, he kept being asked, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" And he would say, "I want to be a missionary to Afghanistan." And they'd say, "Well, there are no missionaries allowed in Afghanistan." And he said, "That's why I want to be a missionary to Afghanistan." And that was his whole life's goal. He studied at seminary at Princeton, a very Ivy League school in the U.S., and after that he was hired by InterVarsity to do student work in North America. And he had a real passionate heart for missions. And Christy Wilson was one of the key people who founded the largest student missionary conference in history, which is known as Urbana. But it happened first in 1946 in the city of Toronto, the very first Urbana conference. And the name Urbana came at the next conference. It happens every 3 years. In 1949, it was held in Urbana, Illinois, at the university there. And now is in a different city. I believe it's St. Louis. And it's still called Urbana. It has grown to something like 20,000 students come over Christmas holidays to focus on Christian missions worldwide. That was actually the conference Diane and I went to in 1967 when we were challenged to go to the Philippines and with Far East Broadcasting Company. So Urbana was all begun by the good work of Christy Wilson. Christy wanted to be a teacher. He knew he'd have to be a tent maker, as he called it. He coined the term tent maker, which is someone who earns their own way but works as a Christian missionary in a country. He knew that he wouldn't be allowed into Afghanistan as a, quote, missionary, but he could as a teacher. And so he took studies and prepared. He applied for jobs but didn't hear anything, and so he went off to Edinburgh, Scotland, to do his PhD. And he finished his doctorate degree there and returned to New York City, where he was studying ESL and linguistics in order to be an ESL teacher. There he met Betty, his wife. She was a lovely Canadian lass from the city of Hamilton, Ontario, studying at a seminary there in New York City, and they met and fell in love and married. And Betty and Christy were able to get a job teaching in Kabul, Afghanistan. They left Canada when this picture was taken in 1951. And they spent 22 years working among the people of Afghanistan. It's an amazing story because they had a tremendous impact. Betty found a lot of blind young people there, and they had no opportunity to get any education. So she started 2 schools for blind people, and they were very significant schools, and they grew to a significant size, and many of those students became followers of Jesus. And because they were blind, they were kind of ignored in that regard. One of them was the leader of the Christian blind group, who was known as the Apostle Paul of Afghanistan. And he later was martyred. But there were many who came to faith. In addition to their teaching roles, every Sunday, the Wilsons had a house church meeting in their home. It started as a small group of expats who were there and visitors who came through. I mean, there were even hippies who would come through Afghanistan and area, just visiting the part of the world they never seen before. And many of these people would come and visit expats and join in this church service. And it grew and it grew and it grew. The last that Dr. Christie told me when we met, and he told me his story, was that it was 4 rooms would be filled with people on Sunday in his home. He would stand in, there was apparently some kind of a doorway where he could share, and everybody in each of the 4 rooms could hear him, and I assume see him. And that's how they had their Sunday services. But they were just praying for a church building. Lord, we need a place to meet where anyone could come and hear the gospel message. Well, it was a Muslim country, but it was a monarchy. Afghanistan had a king for more than 220 years. And that's the way the country operated. And the king was the one who decided everything that needed to be decided at significant levels. And Christie knew that the king was the only one who could allow them to build a church in Afghanistan. Well, the first time that he saw a possibility of this was he heard that President Dwight Eisenhower from the United States was planning to visit the king. The king's name was Zahir Shah, and Zahir Shah was going to host Dwight Eisenhower, the U.S. president, in 1959. Well, President Eisenhower, you may know, was a Christian, but he had never been baptized. And after he became president, he submitted himself to baptism and became a member of the National Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. And his pastor was a close friend who had studied years earlier with Christy Wilson. So here was the plan. Christy Wilson wrote to the pastor of President Dwight Eisenhower. By the way, the name Dwight his mother gave him came from the famous evangelist from Chicago, Dwight L. Moody, who started Moody Bible Institute. Dwight Eisenhower went to church in Washington, and Christy wrote to the pastor and said, let's ask for a reciprocal situation. Because in the 1950s, Washington, D.C. had been requested for a mosque to be built for Muslim expats and diplomats and others who were Muslims to worship in the capital city. But it was especially for expats and that were there. And they gave permission. And a mosque was built in the 1950s in Washington, D.C. So Christy Wilson said to his friend, the pastor of President Eisenhower, would you please ask the president that when he goes to Kabul, Afghanistan, that he would ask the king for a reciprocal situation. We have a mosque in Washington, USA, for you. Would you please allow one church to be built in Kabul, Afghanistan, for those who want to worship Jesus? Eisenhower agreed, and when he went there, he did, and he was so forceful and persuasive that the king agreed. The king said, okay, you may build one church here in Kabul, Afghanistan. Well, Christy told me, it's one thing to get permission. Now you have to have an architectural plan. You have to have thousands and thousands of dollars. Even back then in the this would now be the 1960s when they're trying to work on this. Well, it took 10 years for all of that to come to fulfillment. An architect from New Zealand made the plan, and this was the structure that he planned to build and designed. And it was completed at the end of 1969, and a lot of different people provided the resources. Christy Wilson wrote a book called More to be Desired Than Gold, and it's his story, and of course the story that I'm telling you, and he shares in there just multiple miracles that God did to provide the thousands of dollars they needed to build a church in Afghanistan, a physical church building. And it was dedicated in the summer of 1970. Dr. Ted Engstrom from World Vision International was the guest speaker on that event, and it was a very, very significant day. They had another very forceful lady preacher in the evening service of that day. And that day, one of the hippies was coming through the country and heard about this church and came to the service and committed her life to Jesus. And they thought this was so significant, so symbolic for the very first Sunday that a church building was opened, that a person committed their life to the Lord. In addition, of course, to all of those who had been attending, who had come to faith in Jesus during the ministry of the Wilsons. It was a beautiful day, and they really rejoiced in that. And it was a great place to have for a weekly service, and the services went on week after week. In 1972, Dr. Wilson told me we had a very special guest speaker one Sunday came through, and his name was Brother Andrew from Holland. And of course, Brother Andrew was the founder of Open Doors International, for which I worked for 38 years. And Brother Andrew is a good friend. And he spoke there that day, and we have one picture of that event. There's Dr. Wilson on the right-hand side standing there, and in the background, behind the pulpit, you see Brother Andrew. It looks to me, as I see the picture, that he's praying. It's at this point. But Brother Andrew spoke. When I talked with Dr. Wilson in the 90s later, he told me that Brother Andrew, he said, made a very significant statement that I never forgot. On that Sunday when he spoke there, he made the statement, which I've heard him make other times in other places, but he said to these people, if we don't go to them with the gospel, they will come to us with their guns. And that was always Andrew's prediction. If we don't go to people with the gospel of Jesus, then they're going to come to us with their guns. And of course, we know in many ways that happened in different times and different places. But that was what Andrew mentioned there. And they enjoyed having Brother Andrew at the first church, evangelical Christian church building in Afghanistan. Well, another year goes by, and now the king is getting a lot of pressure from his Muslim leaders in the country, because more and more people have come to faith in Jesus. Not just expats, and not visitors, and not the hippies that were just the hippies going through, but many, many local people. And it came to a point where the king had to say, enough, enough. And that was what he said. And in 1973, King Zahir Shah, who had been ruling for 40 years by this time, said, the church has to be destroyed. He also closed the 2 blind schools that Betty ran because so many of these students had become Christians. And he told the Wilsons they had to leave, and along with any other teacher there who was a Christian. All the teachers were expelled from the country. The Wilsons were actually given 3 days to leave. And the destruction of the church began. On the first day of the destruction, a Christian German businessman who lived in the city went to see the mayor of Kabul. Now, the mayor of Kabul had actually studied in Germany years before, and he was a good friend of this Christian businessman. And the businessman said, you cannot destroy this church building. That is God's house. It is a house of prayer to God. And if he made a prophetic statement. He said, if you destroy that church building, God will destroy your government. And that's exactly what happened. It's an amazing story. So they began to destroy the building. And as they did with bulldozers and whatever, and soldiers coming to dismantle all the pieces of the building, in 1973 in the summer, the Wilsons had now left. They were home and in North America. And he later taught at Gordon Conwell Seminary in Boston area, which is what he was doing when I met him. But they began to destroy the building. Now, the funniest part of the story is this, that the Muslim leaders had heard something about there being an underground church in Afghanistan. And they decided, man, we're going to find that place. And so as they destroyed this church building, they dug 12 feet down below the foundation to try and find the underground church. Well, they didn't find anything but dirt there because it was a metaphorical statement. And they never did find the underground church. But what blessed me was Dr. Wilson said, the reports I got from everybody was that everyone was so sad that their church was being destroyed. But what they did was stand in a circle around the property as the church was destroyed, and they served tea and cookies to the soldiers who were doing, and the workers who were doing the destruction. Of course, those people were just doing what they were told. They had no choice. But they served tea and cookies to those people who destroyed their church building. On the last day, I believe it was July the 17th, 1973, on the final day when the church was now completely destroyed and all the underground digging stopped, that very night, the government was overthrown. There was a coup d'etat, The king had ruled for 40 years, and there'd been a monarchy for 220 some years. And that night, a coup overthrew the king. In fact, I believe it was his brother-in-law who set up a republic. And the government fell on that very day. Now, many Afghan people are superstitious, and there have been those who've told Dr. Wilson, our country has been at war ever since the time when the church was destroyed. It was in the later 70s that the Russians came in, and there was a lot of fighting there, and there just seems to have been constant fighting ever since. But that's what happened with the first church building in Afghanistan. And that's why today there are no church buildings except for the chapel in the Italian embassy compound. The book Christy Wilson wrote is called More to be Desired Than Gold. It's an incredible book, and it's really worth reading. I also have a booklet called Hope for Afghanistan, written in 2002, after Dana Curry and Heather Mercer were released from prison in Afghanistan, and tell some of their story as well. But here's what I want to leave with you today. There is no church building per se in Afghanistan, but there is a church. The church, as we know, is not a building. It's the people who follow Jesus Christ. And there are estimated to be as many as 20,000 followers of Jesus among the Afghan people today in that country. The difficulty for them is that they have no public place to worship. They aren't even many times able to publicly declare their faith. They are what we call secret believers. Pray for them, and pray that someday another church might be able to be built in Afghanistan.